Alright, so welcome back to the cooking stream. Basically, for today, I received a request to make Alfredo sauce, and since a lot of us are kind of stuck inside and can't go to the store too often, I decided to do basically what is the authentic, original type of Alfredo, basically the one that was invented by the man himself in the early 1900s. And the Alfredo sauce that we typically here in the United States is basically filled with a lot of heavy cream. Sometimes people put cream cheese in it as well, and wine and a bunch of other ingredients, and that's fine. It's really delicious on its own, just like that. But often it can be kind of complicated to make something like the Alfredo sauce that we typically have, especially now that we're all kind of stuck inside and can't go to the store as much. It's kind of hard to find all of these separate ingredients and then at the same time kind of risk messing it up, since that kind of Alfredo sauce is a little temperamental and you want to be a little careful with that kind of sauce. And I can go over that another time with that sauce later on. But for today, since I wanted to do something that's pretty simple ingredient wise, I wanted to do the authentic Alfredo sauce. So the one I'm making, basically, it serves around 6 people, maybe more if you don't need as much pasta. But in our household, they eat a lot of pasta, so it's something that is going to go away pretty fast. But what we're doing today is we're going to have about a half pound, of butter. It's really important to use a half pound of butter, and for the other one, you want about a half pound of grated cheese, preferably Parmigiano Reggiano. Basically a block if you can get your hands on it. If you can't get your hands on a block of this type of cheese, don't worry, because I wasn't able to as well. We're using basically not as much of the equivalent, but it's basically this Comte de Montreal, which is basically a French cheese that's kind of similar in pungency, and it's also a hard cheese, and we have it in a block. And we got this pretty affordably as well, which is great. Because since it's easier to find, if we mess up with this, we can have another block just in case. But if you want to go for the authentic thing, I recommend a half pound of Parmigiano Reggiano. And this is something you can find at Costco or your local Vons. That should still be in stock, even with everything going on, since it's not really that highly sought after of an item. The next thing you're going to want is just your simple 1 pound of dried fettuccine. You can use fresh pasta as well, and you can even use spaghetti or another type of pasta, but fettuccine is the most preferred one, since the flat noodles will have more surface area to hold onto the sauce. And so that's basically all that we're going to need for the sauce. Again, typically you would want salt on the side, but since I'm using salted butter, you do not need to worry about putting salt. That should be plain enough, and you can add it later for taste. The only part you will need salt is when we're having the water. And that's why I have a pot right here. And this pot is basically just for boiling your noodles. So just make sure, depending on your pot and depending on how many noodles you're making, in case you're making a double batch or you're wanting to make a half batch, always make sure that you have the water high enough so that the noodles are partially exposed initially when you throw them in there. But enough water that it'll stay submerged. So, okay, there we go. So, the next thing you're going to need is another pot. So I have a really wide one. You can also use a skillet with high edges, but you want something with a lot of surface area that you're able to move the pasta around in after you're done cooking in order for you to make the sauce properly, since this pasta is going to end up being completely coated in the sauce to finish it. So now that that's going, we're just going to make sure that we have our burner set to high. Since we have a powerful burner, we have to be really careful and basically put it not on high, but as close to it as we can. Anything higher and our fan will turn on, which will probably make it hard for you all to hear me. The next thing we need to do is we actually need to cut this butter to make it melt a bit better and more evenly without burning. So you're basically just going to get any standard chef's knife. I have a little smaller version, but it's the same thing. Just a chef's knife that you have and some butter. And again, what I'm doing is going to be a lot more difficult for me since we always freeze our butter. But it's the same premise. You're just going to get your butter, get your knife, and then just start cutting little slices from it. Again, it doesn't matter if they're even or not. It'll be more difficult for me, and it'll probably actually look more neater for you if you have butter used in the fridge, since we have it frozen. But the whole point is we're melting it anyway, so all of this butter is going to be unimportant if it's not uniform. And then, in case for anyone that actually hasn't really cut anything that's kind of difficult to cut, a good word of caution, actually a good tip when you're cutting things, is always make sure your fingers are pointing out, or at least they're like this. When you're either cutting vegetables like this, your curved fingers inwards are actually going to prevent the knife from cutting your fingertips. And if you're doing something very tough, use the palm of your hand and your fingers upwards, because if you accidentally move it over to the side, you're not going to cut yourself, or this way. If you have your fingers here, what's going to happen is you're going to nick your fingers immediately. So you always want to do that and keep it close, just in case you do flip it over. It's not going to wildly move out of the way and again nick yourself. That's the last thing you want to do. So just go over, use your palm, and that's it. Anything that's a little chunkier, you can just cut those in half, or even in thirds. But you just want to have them cut enough so that they melt evenly. A lot of these are looking pretty good. Yeah. So we'll keep those there right now, and we'll check on our water. So you can see that the water is starting to mildly boil. It's not there yet. What you want is to have a rolling boil. And a rolling boil is basically you're going to notice a lot of bubbles coming up all at once. You might even hear the water kind of bubbling at the top, and that means you are at a rolling boil, and that's perfect. Because if you have something like that, that means that your water is ready for your pasta. But right before it gets to rolling boil, what I usually do to add a bit more flavor is I'll make sure I add a bit of sea salt. If you don't have sea salt, regular iodized salt is great as well. But you basically just want to get your palm, pour a bit of salt in, so you have about palm size. I'd say that's about a pinch or two. And then you're just going to throw it inside. And the steam from the water most likely will make some of the salt stick, so you can just wipe the rest off. Doesn't matter if some of it gets out of place or you don't put all of it in there. You only need a bit to add some flavor to the water. And you will notice if your pasta is cooked without salt. If some people also initially put some olive oil in the water, I typically don't, because the less oil that's infused into the pasta, the more likely that the sauce is going to stick when we're starting with it. If you want to put olive oil, you can go ahead and do that right now. I would only recommend maybe a teaspoon, tablespoon at the most. And so yeah, that's about it. So our water is basically at rolling boil right now. You're seeing a lot of bubbles coming up from the top. So what I do to put pasta in neatly is I kind of do something that's untraditional from what you usually see in the movies. My favorite movie has to be Ratatouille, so I usually see them trying to practice putting some pasta in the pot with their box still there. And if I do something like this, especially in our type of stove, because the ceiling's so close, what's going to happen is it's going to basically make me hit my hand and burn it actually. So I just grab about a fistful of the pasta, which is about a pound. I throw it in, and then you're just going to move it around, and it's important that you keep moving it while you're initially putting it in, because if you don't move it around the first time you put it in, what will happen is the pasta will either stick to the bottom of the pot and burn, or it will stick to each other and it will become a very hard, clunky mess, and it won't be that fun to actually eat when you're eating pasta. And so you're just going to keep mixing it until you can tell that the noodles are kind of all drenched in the water and have cooked enough so that it'll prevent them from sticking to each other. Once they've been moved around a bit, you can kind of tell they get a little bit more weighty because they're kind of sinking in the water. And now that they're like that, you want to keep your water on high. Keep that stove on high as much as you can. If you notice the water is a bit too high, don't worry about that. Just as long as it's at a rolling boil, it should be good, or even just a little simmer might be enough. But you just want to keep track of it every now and then, just to make sure that doesn't make your stove a mess. And while you're doing that, you should always look on the box of your pasta, since it gives you the best directions in case you can't remember. Most people know this by heart, but if, well, not most people, but most people who are cooking any sort of fettuccine, so if you want to look right there, it's going to say basically that you want to cook it for approximately 11 to 12 minutes. So since we want this pasta to be al dente, or basically right underneath cooked, we're actually going to put our timer for 10 minutes. So we'll have it for 10 minutes, and while that's going for 10 minutes, we'll just keep our eye on that pasta water that's cooking. Again, every now and then you just want to grab your wooden spoon, spatula, anything you have to move your pasta, and just gently move it a bit. You don't need to move it a lot, just maybe a couple times while it's cooking. And while that's going on, we're actually going to get all of our butter. And over here in this pot, I've had it on low flame to warm it up. Perfectly fine if it's not warm yet, and you're just going to throw all the butter inside. Again, the whole point is to make sure that all the butter is melting, but it's not burning. That's why you keep it on low. If you keep it on high, what will happen is it'll instantly blacken or brown, and just it won't really be something that's tasty to eat, and you may have to restart if you burn your butter. So just keep it on low. Keep the butter there. Most of it's melted already, but we'll leave the rest in there to continue melting. And at this time, if you haven't done so already, or if you're keeping this in mind for later, you can go ahead and start blending, or grating this cheese, which actually reminds me, so if you don't have a grater at home, but you do have a blender that's strong enough to handle it, you can basically go ahead and get any of these blocks of cheese, and you can actually throw it into your blender, pulse it initially just to kind of break it up, and then you can actually start it on low, slowly bring it up to high, and you'll end up with finely grated cheese just like this, which is perfect. And you want them to be finely grated, or at least as fine as you can make it, because if you make it fine enough, you'll be able to easily mix it into the sauce without it clumping up together. So we'll just keep that there. All right. So this recipe, or this suggestion for this type of food was given to me by someone named Victor. So thank you for that. And for anything like that, if any of you would actually want me to do some kind of recipe or some kind of tip for how to cook something, or even just basic safety tips for working in the kitchen, you can always send me a message, again, through the simplecookingstream@gmail.com. If anything, you can even leave a message on Twitch or on YouTube, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can with our ingredients for it. And another important thing too is always make sure, again, you're watching your pasta. And you do want to be careful, because this was probably my own mistake that I've made, but something that you want to do is always kind of lift the pot a bit to kind of pull it down. Sometimes if you think it's going to take too long for it to get ready, you can actually put it on off for now. The pan or pot will stay hot, and it'll keep it melted. And by the time the pasta is done, you can put it back on low, and it should be ready to go. So I'm just checking the pasta again, kind of spinning it around a bit, kind of lifting it up to see how it's going. So the best way to check for thicker pastas if they're cooked is actually, you can look at the color, and you can see that before it was a bit kind of like this yellowish color that was a bit brighter, and now you can see it's kind of changed a bit. We'll see when we're actually done with the pasta. When you break it apart in half, you can notice which parts are cooked and not cooked. Typically the center is going to be a bit of a whitish color versus what's on the outside. And if you have just a little speck of white, just a really small one, something that you can barely notice, that means that the pasta is al dente. Other people usually try throwing pasta on the wall, and while that is really fun to do and something that I used to do when I was starting out with pasta, really your best bet's going to be dealing with the timer and checking the inside of the noodle. If the inside of the noodle is slightly undercooked, that means you are hitting al dente. If you hit a minute or two above that, don't worry about it. It just means it's fully cooked. You may have a softer pasta at the very end, and if anything, you can fix that by putting some cold water on your pasta by the time you drain it. But if anything, if you are under that, you can just keep it boiling for another few seconds or even a minute, and that should get you right up to al dente. Anything past that, about 3 or 4 minutes, what will happen is you'll basically have a very soft pasta, and it may not survive the sauce making process. So you want to be kind of diligent about that. Just make sure that you're checking your timer. Always have something, even have it on your phone if you're walking away from the stove, though I don't recommend that. But that's basically all that you need for your pasta. So again, I'm just checking it again, lifting it up, making sure that it's completely cooked through. And while this is going on, you can just go ahead and grab your strainer. So we have a pretty sizable strainer here, but you don't have to have something this big. You just want to have something that is big enough so that it doesn't splash on you and the pasta water won't kind of leak out. So if you have something with holes too big, your pasta will slide through and you'll be out of pasta in your sink. If you have holes that are too small, what will happen is all of the pasta will actually collect with these holes, and you'll end up with water coming out of the pan. And it's not too big of a deal, but the problem is if you do it too fast, what will happen is that your pasta will start going out with the water, almost like a river, and again, you're going to end up with the same issue. You're just going to have pasta all over your sink, and no one really wants that. So make sure that you have your strainer. I recommend just having it in the sink. Just have it in the sink and just have it moved away with as much as you can from everything else. So again, you won't be able to see too much of it, but currently my strainer is in the sink. And later on I'll show you basically the fact that we can actually save the water, because this is actually an ingredient you're going to use with your sauce. So when you're doing that, I recommend getting a half cup, basically a half cup measuring cup, and basically you need a fourth, but I recommend a half because depending on where you are, the temperature of everything, and basically how watery or thick you want your sauce, you're going to want a half cup just for some spare room to work with. So you also want to make sure that your cup is going to have a plastic handle, and I'll show you that in a bit why. But you just want to make sure you have something like that. There's another way you can do this if you don't have anything like this. Just use the same bowl that you use to maybe hold some ingredients or just something you have lying around that is temperature safe. Do not use a glass bowl. Typically, most of them are made out of what's called soda lime glass, and that's a type of glass that if you have it in something cold and then you move it to something hot immediately or pour boiling water into it, what's most likely going to happen, at the best case scenario, it will crack and you'll ruin your bowl. Worst case scenario, you will have glass shattering everywhere. So typically use ceramic or an aluminum or a stainless steel, any kind of bowl you get your hands on that is temperature safe. So what you can do is keep this bowl right above your strainer. Don't hold it, just put it in there, and then go ahead and pour the pasta into the strainer. So again, you can do that, or you can put it underneath the strainer and go ahead and pour that in as well. But you want to be careful because it may get hot on the bowl and you're going to have to wait a bit or have some gloves to hold it. That's why I typically use a measuring cup with a plastic handle, because then I'm able to actually dip this into the water and then just put it on the side. So what I'm going to do is actually do that right now since we have time. So I'm just going to go ahead and get this. And again, I'm not really burning myself because I have a plastic handle, so it's not transferring heat to me. I'm just going to do this right into this bowl. And it's okay if some spills. It's just there to hold to make sure there's not a mess. And we're going to leave that there because in the next 20 seconds what's going to happen is that timer is going to ring. So if you have any mittens or any sort of hand holders, anything of that sort, or even a rag, that's the best time to get them ready, because now what's going to happen is it's going to ring. So go ahead, always turn your burner off first, grab it, and just bring it over. Alright, so I'm not going to show you so much of the draining process, but if you ever want to bring it back to your stove, keep your pot ready and put it right over the pot. But since we're not going to do that for pasta, since we're not serving it plain, what's going to happen is you're just going to throw it right into the butter. And so now that your pasta's in the butter, you're just going to keep mixing it and keep on mixing it. You're basically coating the pasta in the butter while it's still hot, because the hot butter and the hot pasta mixed together means the pasta's going to keep on cooking. While that's happening, you're going to get your cheese and you're just going to go ahead and while you're mixing it, sprinkle your cheese in there. Now this is the original way how Fettuccine Alfredo was made, and this is a lot easier than what we currently have with heavy cream, maybe some type of another cheese added in. Some people add cream cheese to it. Some people add flour or cornstarch. And again, I'll go over recipes like that. There's so many different ways you can make any sort of Alfredo sauce. And you don't really have to worry too much about how you make it, just as long as it tastes good. So I'm just going to move this over so that the cameraman can actually follow what I'm doing. Again, you want to do it on low heat. And you want to keep it going. You can actually tell already that it's kind of forming into a sauce. And sometimes you don't need to add extra water to it. Sometimes you do. But the most important thing is you keep it moving while it's hot. You just want to keep going. Don't try to pour the entire thing in at once, because what will happen is you're going to have clumps of cheese, and that's not really Fettuccine Alfredo. So keep it going. We're basically going to keep going until all of the cheese is going in. So that's a half pound of butter and a half pound of cheese. So you see it's coming together quite nicely. This process is really similar to making something like macaroni if you're not going to make a bechamel with it. And if any of you want to learn how to make macaroni, my brother actually makes a pretty good one, so I'll definitely get the recipe from him if that's possible, if he'll actually let me get the recipe. And so, if you think it's getting too tough or the cheese is sticking to this sort of spatula or spoon or anything you're using, switch to tongs if it's available. Just makes it a lot easier to toss. Again though, you just want to keep it moving, keep it going, since you can see the cheese is actually coating all of the pasta evenly. So you just want to keep that going. I'm going to put the last of the cheese in here. I'm just going to keep it moving. If you ever had a fettuccine Alfredo from places such as Disneyland, this may seem a little familiar to you. I know when I first had fettuccine Alfredo at a place like that, I was blown away by how much butter was actually left in the container that I had to eat it from, but I was amazed at how flavorful it was, and that was because it was made using the original process. I'm not too sure if they still do that. I haven't been in Disneyland in a while, but this is something that kind of resonates with me whenever I make pasta of this style. Just the sheer amount of butter that's used, but that's actually what was done. And if you don't want to use this much butter, you can actually go ahead and use less. I'd say maybe a few tablespoons less. If you have an issue with butter, maybe you're vegetarian or vegan, you can put olive oil instead, but that still leaves the issue with cheese. I haven't tried it with vegan cheese, but it's something that's a bit of an experiment, and if any of you would like me to try something like that out, I would be all for it, and I would definitely do something like that. If you do want something that's a bit more of a vegan alternative, what you can do is use olive oil and some garlic and fry the garlic in the olive oil, and then go ahead and throw the pasta back into the olive oil, similar to how this was done. And you'll do a similar process with it. You're basically coating the hot pasta in the olive oil that was flavored, and what that does, you'll get a nice garlic olive oil pasta. And you can do that with anything that you have. Again, the whole point is that the oil is going to infuse into the pasta and finish it cooking so that you have a finished dish. And that's it. There you have it. So now you have fettuccine Alfredo, and you can see that all of the cheese has melted evenly, and you have it coating the entire pasta. And I'm pretty sure that my family's going to be pretty happy to eat something like this. But yeah, that's about it. If any of you have any questions with how I made this, any questions for alternative, and then I almost forgot, so one thing you do want to remember is if you want to make it a bit more of a liquidy sauce, you can just add a bit of water. Not too much. You want to be very sparse with that water. Again, we reserve the half cup, but you do not have to use all of the half cup. You can use only a little bit of it. But the whole point is that the water is meant to break up the thickness of the sauce. And I'm pretty sure that depending on who you are, not everyone's going to have the same preference for a thick sauce. There you go. There's a little water added. You see it kind of broke it up a little bit, but not so much that the cheese is falling off of the noodles. And there you go. Fettuccine Alfredo. So if anyone has any questions or any comments, leave them on our Twitch page, leave them on our YouTube page, send us an email at the Simple Cooking Stream at gmail.com. There's no the in front of it, it's just Simple Cooking Stream. And if you ever would like to see any other photos of what I've cooked, I'll have that on my Instagram page as well at Andy L. Andrew. There's no spaces. And other than that, if you have any more suggestions, comments, feel free to leave them. And that's about it. Thank you for watching.